here. I have a seat maybe right in the front. All right. All right. Well, I should say that this man probably needs no introduction if you have heard even the words, the Panama Papers. This man is largely responsible for much of that. So welcome, everyone. My name is Susan Page, and I am the director of the Weiser Diplomacy Center. I'm also a professor of practice at the Ford School and also at the law school. And I want to introduce today our speaker, who spent the first half of his career doing what many great reporters do, fiercely guarding scoops. Like most journalists, he worked alone, chasing elusive tips, looking for the news, but ultimately keeping the story close at hand until it was ready to print. It served him well. Early in his career, Gerard Ryle made his name by exposing a company that defrauded investors by getting them to invest in a magic pill that you could just drop into your engine in your gas tank to boost efficiency and cut emissions. But there was a problem. The pill didn't work. So some of you may think about some of our other stories we've heard recently about similar, inventions that didn't quite work. Well, over time, and after a year here at the University of Michigan as a Knight Wallace Journalism Fellow, Gerard realized that some stories were just too big for one single reporter or for even a single newsroom. The systems of secrecy that protect corruption stretch across continents, and no single person could follow every thread. So he built something new. As executive director of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, Gerard turned a loose network of reporters into a global force that produced some of the biggest and most consequential investigations in journalism history. The Pulitzer Prize-winning Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers, the FinCEN files, and the implant files, and many, many more. So please join me in welcoming the Executive Director of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, Gerard Ryle. We're going to play a quick video, and then Gerard, sorry.
Financial records in history.
Published by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists.
For over 25 years, the nonprofit International Consortium of Investigative Journalists has brought together reporters from across the globe. Working with hundreds of media outlets on every continent, we use cutting-edge technology to analyze large data sets and expose corruption and broken systems worldwide. Together, we've exposed some of the biggest stories of this century. Our projects have toppled world leaders, sparked protests, and fueled social change. Stories that rock the world.
Thank you, Ambassador Page. Having heard that wonderful introduction, you probably are likely anticipating some fierce investigative reporter. So here's something about me you probably weren't expecting. One of my first jobs was at a newspaper in rural Ireland that was notorious for the fact that its editor was a former circus magician who, with no background whatsoever in publishing. He had, let's say, an unusual approach to journalism. One week, the entire front page was blank, save for the headline, "No news this week." One of my big scoops from this era was a report about the mysterious disappearance of undergarments from clotheslines around the town. The headline, Knicker on the loose. As you can imagine, embellishing the truth in this environment was not something that was entirely frowned upon. My friend Seamus worked for a small newspaper on the west coast of Ireland. He claims they were desperately short of a picture story one week. So, over a few pints of Guinness, they made up the heartbreaking tale about two donkeys who lived together for many years on a small island. And then one of them died. They settled on a headline, "The loneliest donkey in the world." Seamus and his colleagues, they found a photograph of a donkey, and that week's edition went off without a hitch. But they had forgotten one crucial dynamic. It was a regular practice of the BBC to troll small newspapers for odd and quirky stories. The phone rings. It's the BBC. They're making arrangements to fly over the island. Now, this presented more than one problem for Seamus and his colleagues. Not only had they to find a donkey that looked like the one in the photograph, they also had to find an island. And they had to find a way of getting the donkey to the island. So that's how Seamus claims to have found himself at one end of a rowing boat with a donkey at the other end and the sound of a distant aircraft overhead. Like many young Irish at the time, I decided to immigrate, in my case to Australia. And it was there that I realized that the primary purpose of journalism was not to entertain people, but to inform them with proven facts. Over the next 20 years, I mainly worked as an investigative reporter, revealing things that powerful people didn't want revealed. I exposed big medical and social scandals. I investigated police corruption. At one point, I faced jail for refusing to reveal a source. Then one day, a story came along that really was like one of those fairy tales we like to tell in Ireland. A man claimed to have invented a magic pill. And you put this pill in your motor vehicle, and suddenly your fuel lasted 20% longer. And what's more, it got rid of all of the toxic emissions. Now already you're probably thinking, this is a perfectly silly story. But the magic pill man, he raised nearly $100 million from investors who all believed they were going to be rich when this company launched on the British Stock Exchange. The Australian Trade Commission, it wanted to believe so badly, it had an entire section of its website devoted to this company. The company got nearly $600,000 in taxpayer grants for sales it had never made. For what you have to understand at this stage is that this was no ordinary company. It had no factories. It had no trucks. In fact, it had no actual product for sale at all. But it had penetrated deeply into Australia's elite. Many of them secretly held shares in the company, and they too thought they were going to be rich. So when I exposed all this as a fraud, I spent my time defending 4 different lawsuits, public attacks in the Australian Senate, and I went through all of the despair and the doubt that all investigative reporters go through when powerful people don't want something made public. This firm was registered in a tax haven called the British Virgin Islands. And what it had been doing was sending the money it was getting from selling the shares to the British Virgin Islands and then bringing the money back into Australia as if it were sales of the magic pill. If new investors could be found and the price of the shares continued to rise, the game went on. It continued for nearly 18 months, even after I exposed it as a fraud, until finally the company stopped paying the lawyers who were suing me. By then I realized that I was staring at something much bigger, a secret universe that allowed this kind of thing to happen. and my pill company was only a very small part of it. After I wrote a book about the magic pill, a mysterious package arrived in the mail. It was a computer hard drive, the kind you could buy in any store. But this one was packed with documents from a law firm in Singapore that had set up the pill company's legal structures in the British Virgin Islands and in other tax havens. At the time, I didn't have the skills to see everything that was in there, but I did manage to read some spreadsheets that had names of the law firm's other clients. I remember Googling one Canadian name. It was a man who was missing. He had allegedly been killed by a drug cartel. And yet, here he was inside my documents with an email address that read something like ontherun@hotmail.com. And I remember thinking to myself, wouldn't it be great if I knew a Canadian journalist I could give this to? But this presented me with a dilemma. I had spent most of my career as an investigative reporter. By nature, investigative reporters are lone wolves. We fiercely protect our secrets, sometimes even from our editors, because we know that the minute we tell them what we're working on, they'll want the story right away. And to be frank, when you find a good story, you like to keep the glory to yourself. But there is no doubt that we live in a shrinking world and that the media has largely been slow to wake up to this. The issues we report on are more and more transnational. Giant corporations, though they operate businesses on a global scale, environmental and health crises, they're global. So too are financial flows and financial crises. So it seems staggering that journalism has been so late to tackle stories in a truly global way. And it seems staggering too that journalists have largely ignored some of the possibilities that technology brings, rather than being frightened of it. The reason journalists are scared of technology is this: the profession's largest institutions are experiencing tough times because of the changing way that people are consuming news. The advertising business models that have sustained reporting are broken, largely because of technology. The internet, social media, smartphones, now AI. And that has plunged journalism into crisis, forcing institutions to re-examine how they function. But where there's crisis, there's also opportunity. It's funny how sometimes life throws up opportunities in batches. A few weeks after I got the hard drive in the mail, I got an email from Charles Eisendrath, the then director of the Knight Wallace program here at the University of Michigan. I had been his former fellow. Charles was on a board of an organization that ran an outfit called the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. It had been set up many years earlier as part of a larger American nonprofit. It was primarily designed at that time to network investigative reporters from around the world. He told me that we're looking for somebody new to run the network, and how did I fancy living in Washington for a few years? This presented me with my second dilemma. Should I take a large pay cut, ask my wife to leave her job and our home in Australia to move across the world to work for a non-profit? And what exactly did I have? The raw data that I had was in all kinds of formats. It was very difficult to read without specialist help. If you go, when I went sometimes 4 deep into the folders that were on the disk, I found emails, random PDFs with passport and home addresses, and spreadsheets with the names of thousands of clients. What I had was an unprecedented glimpse into another universe, a secret world that allows rich and powerful people to play by different rules. I was staring at the very machinery of corruption. This is a machine that defies all the best efforts of policymakers, a machine that relies on one thing, and one thing above all others: secrecy. growing up in Ireland, I thought the biggest threats to democracy were the ones you could see. A bomb on the street, a rifle at a checkpoint, soldiers on the nightly news. I know better now. Sometimes the real threats are quieter. Bank accounts that no one can trace, companies that only exist on paper, lawyers who can make elected presidents and prime ministers invisible. These threats don't come with gunfire. They come in the quiet shuffle of papers that bleed entire nations dry and leave the children of these poor nations dying of malnutrition. Sometimes the most dangerous threats to democracy don't storm capitals, roll tanks through the streets, or send soldiers into the polling stations. They sometimes slip in quietly, dressed in tailored suits. Policymakers simply can't regulate what they can't see. I didn't realize when I took that call from Charles that I had just taken the first step towards building what would become the most powerful network of investigative journalists that ever existed. And together, we were soon going to literally change the world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for giving us a good sense of how this all came to be. Would you tell us first about your experience as a Knight Wallace Fellow? And obviously you got the call from the then director, but what did you do while you were here?
Well, I actually spent a lot of my time researching a story that became the first story I did when I actually went and took this new job in Washington, because I didn't have the confidence. I didn't know that I could actually look at this data, or I wasn't sure I could get into the back of it, and I didn't want to tell anyone when I was doing the interview for the job that I had the data. So I basically came with an idea that I'd actually spent most of my year here researching, and that was this strange story about how big corporations on Wall Street can make millions of dollars recycling human corpses. And basically, this is a story that I had been fascinated with for a number of years, but there was at the time there was headlines about this former dentist that had bought a funeral home, and every time somebody brought a body into the funeral home, he would take the valuable parts of the body out, like the skin, the bone, the long bones, the skin on the back. And these products are basically recycled and used for cosmetic surgery, or sometimes when you wonder why an athlete can get back on the football field so quickly after a cruciate ligament injury, they're likely actually getting a part from a corpse. But there was this particular dentist, he was literally bringing the bodies in, taking all the valuable parts out, then forging the paperwork and sending them to these factories on Wall Street. And one of the famous people that this happened to was Alistair Cook. And he was a very famous journalist that did, Letters to America for the BBC. Yeah. And he died, I think, in his 90s of cancer. And this former dentist forged the papers and pretended that he had donated the body. And it was a kind of a topic that really fascinated me. So when I went to the ICIJ in Washington, this was the first story I decided to take on. So I had my research done. And I managed to get about 8 media partners involved, mostly freelancers. And when we found what I thought was a really great story, we found that they were sourcing bodies in Ukraine from families that weren't giving proper permission, and then shipping these bodies to Germany, and they were coming in to America as if they were German bodies. So we went and we interviewed the families, and of course they said they hadn't, they didn't know what was going on, they didn't know this was happening. And we pulled together what I thought was a pretty good story. And so I went to the Washington Post with this story, and I said, look, great story. And then the then investigations editor of the Washington Post taught me my first big lesson. He said, Gerard, how do I know I can trust any of this research when you're using freelance reporters? And that's when I learned that you really do need to have reporters involved with your stories from the very first day. Because if their reporters are involved, they trust the research, but secondly, they also then give the story, because they've invested a lot in the story, they give the story a very good run. So the next story I did was actually from that disc that I'd managed to get a hold of from the British Virgin Islands, and that was very different.
Wow. So you talk about how data can help and has helped with all of this, but that you didn't yourself have a lot of knowledge. You received this flash drive, but how do you read? Some things are in PDFs, some things are just spreadsheets. But I know that ICIJ, uses large data sets and analyzes that information. How did you manage to find journalists or others who actually knew how to produce or, summarize these large data sets?
Well, I guess I took the job on in Washington under the misconception that the organization, the larger nonprofit we were then part of, we're now entirely independent, was very famous for what was called computer-assisted reporting. And I assumed, in my naive way, that computer-assisted reporting meant that you used a computer to help you in the reporting. It was actually all about pivot tables, and it was very, very simple stuff. And so when I took the job, I assumed that they had a team of reporters who could get into the back of the disk, open it up, tell me what was in there, and then we would put together a huge, collaboration basically with the reporters at the center. But we were just the foreigners there. I mean, if I can be really honest, I went to ICIJ thinking that I had a budget of about $1.5 million and a staff of 7. And I got there, and we were in the basement of the building, and there were I had 3 staff members. In fact, there were more mice in our room than there were people, and I know that for a fact because one of my reporters at the time was so kind. He used to catch the mice and walk across the street and release them.
Aww.
So, yeah. And so I knew I needed to change the model. I mean, I just needed help. And because I'd come from a big media company where I was used to having 400 reporters and graphic artists and photographers, to this situation where I really had nothing, I knew I needed to change my model and do things. So that's where I had this concept of finding a great story and then going to media partners with the story, and in return for giving them this story, they would give me their reporters and their photographers and the graphic artists and other things. But
so do we have to be worried here?
What? In terms of... Look, I mean, I will always look for an opportunity. I will also see something and think, okay, how can I do things better? Or if I can't, I was in a pretty desperate situation. Remember, I'd moved from Australia for a job I was also, wasn't a very good investigative reporter. I should have done more research. But when I got there, I just thought, we have some really good material. You're talking about data. The reason why I thought the data would be useful is that I knew that if I could get data from multiple different countries, then I would be able to approach a reporter with unique data from that country, and they would be much more interested in helping me than if you were to go there with a broad concept. Like the body story was really just a concept. We didn't have anything. But when I have data, I'm able to go to a reporter and say, look, I've got 45 names from Brazil, and I'm going to a Brazilian reporter, or 25 names to a Nigerian journalist. They're much more likely to say to me, well, look, I'll be very happy to help you. And they also have that expertise, because the Nigerian journalist will look at the 25 names, and he'll say, well, that's the brother-in-law or the sister-in-law of the president, in which case you're already getting that unique information and that insight that you wouldn't get if you were at the beginning, when I was Googling the Canadian name, I was just getting random information. Here, but don't get the impression that it all landed smoothly. I mean, the first concept I had for this disc was that we would copy the disc and send it to different parts of the world. And then the reporters would fly in for a weekend, look at the material, get a story, and then go home and publish it. It was an absolute disaster. I mean, the first year of ICIJ, I was making mistake after mistake. I was trying to understand how you could do this kind of cross-border reporting. And it was only when we decided to put the material in the cloud and allow the reporters to look at the material 24/7, which is what we do now. But because we were a very small non-profit, even by the time we got the Panama Papers, and we had a few successes before then, we had no money. So we were doing all this on the fly. I can tell you that we built, and how we work is we have this online newsroom that reporters go to, and they talk to each other securely online. But of course, we didn't have any money for it. So we basically adapted software that had been designed as a dating website. And we used that software to bring the reporters. All the Panama Papers was done this way. And then we needed to share the documents, obviously, with the reporters. So our clever people basically found, again, open source software that had been designed for librarians to share books. And so we used that software and adapted it for the Panama Papers. And of course, at the time, no one had ever heard, even though we did have a few big successes before, no one had really heard of us. So again, security wasn't upmost in our mind, and we were able to fly under the radar.
But you talk about security, but at the same time, you had already faced really serious threats. Okay, in the case of the pill company, the lawyers, eventually they realized they weren't being paid.
Yeah.
Well, as a lawyer myself,
Yeah.
of course I teach, I don't get paid in that same way. You must have been aware that exposing these very senior officials in multiple different countries, at least with the Panama Papers, that your investigative journalists from all of these different countries could come under pretty serious threat. How did you protect them?
It's a really good question. I guess we protected them by listening to them. They were telling us what the threats were in their country. And the thing about journalism is that my biggest concern, because I mostly worked, in America, Australia, Ireland, was always lawyers. Lawyers were my biggest threat. But in some of these countries, it's much, they had to get out of the country before we were ready to publish. Or in some cases, they would help us with the story, but then not have their names attached to the story, because if they had their names attached to the story, they would immediately be under pressure in their country. And in a funny way, it kind of worked because we were doing these stories in big consortiums. Just to give you an idea, Panama Papers, by the time we got to Panama Papers, our first project was 8 media partners. Then by the time we did the disc on the pill, it was about 42 media partners. We got to Panama Papers and we had reporters from 80 different countries. We had 376 reporters all working together around the world, and about, I think it was 90 media partners. They were all sharing information, but by working together, you had a certain sense of safety, because the reporters who couldn't put their names to the story were still giving us the material that was relevant for our stories. We were publishing internationally, and then they were able to report their own story about what the BBC had reported, or Le Monde had reported, or what the New York Times had reported. So there was a certain safety in numbers. And the people who were genuinely in danger of their lives were able to get out of the country before we were ready to publish. And so they were out. The Russian reporters, for instance, all got out. One of our biggest stories in the Panama Papers was about how people close to Vladimir Putin there were these companies, and basically it was $2 billion had gone through these companies. And when we first got a hint of this, there was all these companies, again, fantastic work by our team behind the scenes, connecting all the dots. They found that all of these companies were all linked to one guy in Russia, and he was a cello player in an orchestra. And our Russian reporters told us at the beginning, they said, this guy is nobody. We don't know who he is. Wow. And of course, we were thinking, well, he must be important because there's $2 billion going through these companies. And of course, eventually, by continuing to work, we found out that this guy was actually the godfather of Vladimir Putin's child. And again, when we had that story, you can imagine the nervousness of the Russian reporters when they realized that we were onto something very big. So they were telling us, they needed to be out of the country. But also we had this policy, this US way of working, where we always go to everybody well in advance and give them an opportunity to tell us if there's something wrong with our story, or give them our questions and things.
So you went to Vladimir Putin.
Dear Mr. Putin, we wrote this big long letter, and the Russian reporters were saying, and normally we would do this 3 weeks in advance, And they were saying, no, that's not how we do journalism in Russia. You go the night before. And we were saying, we just cannot do that, because again, our policy is to give everyone an opportunity to, no story. No story is ever black and white. I've learned that. Lots of grey in every story. And if you have grey in the story when you're writing it, it's actually a much better story, because you're putting context around everything. So we got it was very funny writing a letter to Vladimir Putin, dear Mr. Putin, and there was hundreds and hundreds of questions at that stage and we thought, well, we have to do it. So we eventually agreed with the Russian reporters that they would leave the country, and then 1 week before publication, we would send the letter to Mr. Putin, and then he did us an enormous favor. There was a press conference called at the Kremlin, and they denounced this organization that no one had ever heard of called the ICIJ. And our phones went crazy.
Wow.
Well, first of all, every reporter who wasn't involved in the project wanted to know what the hell was going on. And then I had all of these editors, really high-powered editors of all these publications around the world, because we'd been working in secret for a year at this stage, and they'd invested a lot in it. And our way of working is that we all published together at exactly the same moment. And I had agreed with everybody that we were publishing the following week. And of course, all the editors were screaming at me saying, we have to publish now. We have to go now. And I said, are you kidding me? He's setting us up. This is a fantastic audience builder for us. And so we held the line, and we published exactly at the same moment the following week. And Putin basically gave us an audience. And in fairness to Putin, after we published, he thought this story was all about him, because all the questions he got were about him and his people. But then he realized that all his enemies were in there too. You had like the then leader of Ukraine, who he hated, was in the Panama. David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK, his father was in the document. In fact, Cameron nearly fell. He was literally on the verge of falling in the UK after 5 days, because we published the story, and it was about his father having this trust. And David Cameron came out and said, look, everyone knows my father was involved in offshore, and he tried to play the story down. I had nothing to do with this trust. And of course, by day 2, he changed the story. By day 3, he changed the story again. By day 5,
he announced Brexit.
Well, and then he went on to announce Brexit. I know, we're probably to be blamed for that. But Putin came out and basically confirmed that everything we'd said was true. And he explained the $2 billion by saying, oh no, it was to buy musical instruments. And that was his only explanation,
That's all he needed to give.
Yeah.
Well, if you could go back for us, we're talking now, okay, you've got this great exposure, but how did it really start? You talk about, okay, this small organization, you had 3 employees, et cetera, and lots of mice. How did you actually get these different media organizations together? Because now it's over 290 or something media outlets that work with you or work with the journalists. How are they affiliated with ICIJ?
Well, I got there by making the mistake of thinking, because I was an executive at a newspaper, I thought I would just go to the bosses of the newspapers and the TV stations with my idea. And of course, I remember one occasion, I think it was at Le Monde in France, I was downstairs for almost 2 hours waiting to go upstairs, and I thought they'd forgotten I was even there. I finally get in to see the editor, and her attitude was understandable. Like, why should we work with you? Why would we want to work with you? I've got 40, 50 different correspondents around the world. Why would I want to share information with you? I realized early on that not going to bosses was a smarter thing to do. Going to a reporter. Now, if you go to an investigative reporter, and if they're good, they will do anything to get that story. And if you set up the projects in a way where you're only going to one newspaper, one TV station, and one radio station in each country, then they were going to always get the scoop in that country. So you gave the reporters what they needed. And of course, if you can get a reporter interested in the story, they will do all the advocacy that is ever needed inside their organizations. We need 9 months, we need 5 more people. They did it all for me. And so, but also a very important element was trust. like building that trust slowly. That first project with the corpses, that was about 8 reporters. And then, of course, we worked with some of them again. When we did the next project, it was, 100 reporters, but some of them we would never work with again because they weren't good collaborators. So instead of going to superstars at each organization, we were going to reporters who were willing to share information. Because it was very important that if you saw something in the documents, that was very important. And a very practical example in the Paradise Papers, we saw the Queen of England, and she was in there. And so the British reporter who saw it then had to explain to me, to everybody, why they thought it was important. That shades of grey I'm talking about, the context. Why would we care about the Queen of England? She doesn't pay taxes anyway. Well, it turned out that she, through her private funds, she was buying hire purchase companies that were charging 100% interest to people, to poor people. So it became a good story, Or another great example from the Panama Papers, one of the first names we saw was the Prime Minister of Iceland. And he was one of the first names that popped out at us. And we had to get a reporter in Iceland involved in this. And of course, we didn't know anybody in Iceland. So we went to our Swedish media partners and said, do you know anybody there? And they recommended this guy. And they said it was very important to pick the right person in each country because Iceland is so small, I think 300,000 people.
Everyone will know.
And everyone's related, and everyone knows everybody else. So it was really important to get this person. But and again, context, we saw the name. It was a British Virgin Island company called Wintris. And it had been established before this guy had become a politician. So if we had just rushed out with it, he would have easily responded by saying, well, look, I was a businessman back then, nothing to do. But the reporter in Iceland was able to continue to dig. And he found that, first of all, the Prime Minister had never disclosed his secret ownership of this company. He had sold the company to his wife for $1 the day before rules had come in where he had to disclose it. And the other really big thing is that this Prime Minister had been elected to sort out the financial mess in Iceland because all the banks had collapsed. And he'd been elected to sort that mess out. And so our reporter, working for free in Iceland, basically went through all of the bankruptcy records of the banks. And sure enough, in there, one of the creditors was this company in the British Virgin Islands called Wintris, secretly owned by the Prime Minister, which is why when we published the story, within 24 hours of publishing, the people of Iceland, I don't know if you've seen the photographs, but they surrounded the Parliament building in Iceland and they threw yogurt and bananas at the building, demanding that this guy resign. And within 24 hours, he had resigned.
Wow.
And then, of course, that was the second great breakthrough we had, thanks to Putin first. Here's the second thing. Everything to do with Panama Papers became huge.
It did.
There were protests all over the world, and then there were even protests in Pakistan, which eventually led to the Prime Minister of Pakistan falling, and he went to jail over this. And again,
many of them have.
Yeah. Some people go to jail. He's now back in power, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So before I turn it over to questions from those here, and I've got some online as well, I wanted to ask you, how do you get the information in the first place?
Yep.
Before you even say, okay, we saw David Cameron's name in here, or
Yep.
Queen of England. I mean, what's different about the trove of documents that you get from, let's say, WikiLeaks?
Well, I think the main difference is that we put context around the information, whereas WikiLeaks' policy was to get information and then publish everything, damned the consequences. We wanted to take a different approach. We wanted to take a journalistic approach where we were looking only for information that we thought was in the public interest and only publishing that information. You've got to remember, each one of these data sets, we have bank account numbers, we have the passwords to the bank accounts, we have their passport details.
But how did you get those? I mean,
Oh, you're asking.
No, I mean, not to disclose secrets, but I mean,
Yep.
okay, ICIJ gets a name, but before you even got a name, let's say when you started with the corpse issue, but okay, you got some notoriety from that, but how would I know? I've got a suspicion that this new company is doing something weird. Do I just, I've heard of ICIJ, I'm going to send them what? How do I, who sends you information? How do you receive it? Who comes to you?
Well, the challenge these days for investigative reporting has really changed since I was young doing it. You know, it would take ages to get information. Your challenge was actually finding information. These days, because everything has been digitized, it's very easy for somebody inside a company just to copy every single record of this company. Like the Panama Papers was 11.5 million documents copied from a law firm in Panama. And someone had literally gone in there and taken every record for 20 years of this company.
So it's like the Pentagon Papers.
It's exactly.
In some ways.
Panama, that's where it came, the idea came from for the name. But yeah, exactly. So these days, there's a lot of information. And the challenge a lot of the time is understanding and making sense of information rather than actually trying to get the information. These document sets all came from whistleblowers who decided that, I mean, the famous one being the John Doe from Panama Papers, who said that crimes are being committed and he wanted to expose these crimes. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think even John Doe knew how many crimes we were going to expose when he gave us the documents, but he knew something was wrong, mm-hmm. and he gave the documents. And then because we had so many journalists looking at the material, we were able to tease out all these different stories. And because we had this policy of doing it properly and taking our time and working together and not scooping each other, we're able to really get the impact that you get when you publish these stories. Because when you're publishing in 80 different countries and there are 100 different publications all publishing stories, it becomes a firestorm, mm-hmm. And when you start having resignations, it's like even afterwards people that aren't working on the project are coming in and doing stories. I mean, I still remember 2 weeks after publication, I went to London. And the Times of London was not one of our media partners, but their lead story was still the Panama Papers. Mm. And it was to do with personalities that they'd noticed that we had missed. Mm-hmm. Like they were Hollywood stars in the documents that we hadn't even seen. Yeah.
Great. Okay, can I open it up to questions from the floor?
I'll take the prerogative. Our
resident journalist.
What were some of the other processes for Pandora and for the others? Like, was it a big hard drive, or was it a number of people coming with the same type of lead? How did those happen?
Yeah, the documents come in different formats and different sources basically for each one. Sometimes they've copied, like Panama Papers, 11.5 million documents. It didn't actually all come in one go. Mm-hmm. We got 1 million documents at first. And in fact, to be really honest, there were actually 2 different sources for the material. We originally got about 1 million documents from one entirely different source, and then the John Doe came along and gave us another 1 million, and then the next month another 1 million, and the next, and they were also huge challenges for us, because when you're getting information that's coming in batches, you then have to start your searches all over again, and you have to index everything. With Pandora Papers, which was larger, I think we had about, I can't remember, was it 13 million documents there? Do
you want to just briefly tell what the Pandora Papers were about?
The Pandora Papers which is basically bigger, better, like Panama Papers had, I think we managed to find about 50 elected officials that had secret offshore companies. Pandora Papers had many more again. It came from a completely different source. We did manage to get all of that in one go. And so we're able to index it and look. Our process is, the very first thing we have to do, and I'm going to make an admission here, all of this is stolen material. Someone has taken it illegally from somewhere, but as a journalist under the US law, it doesn't matter where you get the material from. It's about public interest. So the first thing I did with Pandora Papers was to sit down over Christmas back in Australia in my home, and I looked through the documents to see what public interest there might be in the documents. And then I wrote a memo for our lawyer. And I sent the memo.
See, lawyers are important.
Lawyers are very important to protect you. But the argument being basically why we should do this, why we should be allowed to look at the material. Because it was pretty sensitive material. Again, world leaders, politicians, but worse, like criminals, people are involved in child smuggling and other things, and drug dealing. They're all in there. Pretty easy to find public interest material there. And then, of course, we then index all the documents. Now we're very sophisticated compared to the beginning. I mean, we index all the documents within about a week, and then we make them available to all the reporters around the world. The first thing our data team does is look for country by country lists, because of course that's very, so if, again, going back to the Brazilian, if you have 50 Brazilian names, it's going to be no problem for us to get a Brazilian reporter involved. And then we just bring them in, we let them look at the material. What we try to do, and we couldn't do this during the pandemic, but we bring all the reporters together in one place. And we say, okay, over 2 days, this is what we think.
Literally in one place,
literally
not
in one
over
place.
Zoom.
No, well, we did it with Zoom, with Pandora Papers because of the pandemic. But before that, say with Panama Papers, we met first in Washington, D.C., again, all secretly. We had about 50 reporters who managed to come. And then we had a second meeting in Germany at the offices of Süddeutsche Zeitung, who were the German media partner who had brought us the John Doe material. And I remember that too, because like at the beginning of that whole process, the editor of Süddeutsche Zeitung, who had a huge say over everything, was very skeptical about the amount of time that I was saying we needed to take to do this. And he said, oh, look, I think when we first sat down to talk about the material, he said, and this was in April 2024, or whatever it was, and he said, I want it all done by September. And I thought, there's no way we're going to get this done by September. So actually in September, we had about 103 reporters all secretly turn up to the Süddeutsche Zeitung headquarters. And what we did is we had everyone introduce themselves one by one. And so
that took until October.
Exactly. I am blah, blah, blah from Costa Rica. I am blah, blah, blah from Nigeria. And by the time we got around, the editor turned to me and said, take as long as you need, And that's how you kind of, like, there's little things you can do to lobby people.
And how, sorry, just to add on to Daniel's question, how do you verify even the information in the first, so John Doe sends you this stolen material that he's copied off of, company X, and it winds up in your inbox or in a manila envelope. How do you know that this is even accurate?
It's a great question. We were very lucky with Panama Papers because we already had 1 million documents from Mossack Fonseca. And so we were able to cross-reference those documents with the new documents that John Doe was sending, and we knew that were a complete match. But in most cases, it's why you take the time. You basically go outside the documents, you look for court records, or you even go to the British Virgin Islands, because you can actually see that the company has been registered there. You just can't see who's behind it. And so you're verifying all the time. And then, of course, that very crucial thing at the very end, where you go to the person for comment and you say, dear Mr. Putin, this is what we're seeing. Tell us if we're wrong. And that's very important.
So you have more about the verifying the documents than verifying the person who exposed the documents.
Every source has got their own reasons for giving the documents. Sometimes those reasons may not be the best reasons.
But that's less important than the public interest in the exposure.
It is really about the public interest. And that's all we have to answer to our lawyers. You being a lawyer, you would know. But it's, as long as you can get that. I mean, I know that they had their reasons for giving us the documents that weren't sometimes pure. But the outcome, I thought, was very pure. And another beautiful thing about doing this kind of work, when you have all of these reporters all looking at the same set of documents from all these different cultural backgrounds, it's really difficult, even for Putin, to come out afterwards and say that you got it wrong or that you were biased in any way.
Right, because it was for musicians and new instruments.
Yes,
$2 billion worth. Great.
Good explanation.
Exactly.
Yes,
There are questions?
Fascinating talk. How are you using AI right now, and do you have concerns for us being used by AI in the future? Thank you.
Yes, we are using it. The part that AI is very complex. You've got what they call Gen AI, which is that large language model system. We don't use that so much, but we're using machine learning right back to Panama Papers, where we're basically Because a lot of the reporters identify a particular document that they think is like it could be a Swiss reporter who said, oh, I've just noticed in the Panama Papers, and this is a true thing, that we can identify all of the Swiss passports that are in there. And of course, our first question then was, well, how do we identify all the American passports and all of the other passports we want to look at? And so what he found is that there was a particular line in the passport. And so we were able to train our machines to find every other document that had those particular lines. And that became something that we repeated over and over again in all the other projects. And so if you find an amazing bank document, you can immediately teach the machine to find every other. And so what you're trying to do all the time is reduce the amount of person time you have to use to look through. So if you've got 11 million documents and you were to read every single one of them, I think someone calculated it would have taken you 20 years to read them. Whereas so what you're trying to do is get the computers or the power of the machines basically to help you with your reporting. So we're very advanced on that now. We actually got particular grants for it, and we're hoping to advance that. We also now, because we're a non-profit, we make all of our software available. So all of the material our data share, which is our new version of the library file sharing system, which is now our own, we make it available for anyone, including academics, to use. I mean, it's powerful. It can basically ingest every type of document and make it easy for you to read. We've also learned how to, if we have a new document set, we can put every member of the US Senate and their family members into one spreadsheet, send it into our documents, and it will spit out
every time
the names.
That name is picked
and it
up.
doesn't mean that, of course, that it's, again, that's where the shoe leather reporting comes in. You've got to then go through every one of those hits to see if it's actually a hit or whether it's a false hit. So what you're doing is reducing the amount of time for the reporter. If you can do that and do it often, then it's very useful. I think with large language model and Gen AI, it's too inaccurate. It's not accurate enough for us, and therefore it's going to be very difficult for us to use. But again, the training that's involved in that will help us build tools, I think, to do this work better. Because coming back to what I said, our challenge these days is not finding information. We're getting inundated terabytes of information. It's making sense of the information. And so if we can do that better, then we can do better reporting.
Okay, thank you.
And then in the future, do you have concerns about AI?
I do have concerns. I think that, my biggest concern is the amount of things it gets wrong. And for me as a reporter, I think if we're going to rebuild the trust that I think has been lost in the media, we need to go back to a fact-based, trust-based system. And I think that is not helping. But again, everything I've been saying is you've got to embrace and use new technology if you want to do things better, but you just got to use it the right way.
Okay. Yes.
Thanks, this has been great.
Do you want to say who you are?
I'm Lynette Clementson. I'm the director now of the Knight Wallace Fellowship, and eternally grateful to Charles for having you in the fellowship and for you being here. Susan, you're a fantastic moderator. Because when we sort of hear about these big investigations, traditional reporting and reporters tend to be the star.
Yeah.
But you've talked a lot around the edges about learning how to search data and putting information together. Just whenever we have reporters in a university context where people in the room have a lot of skills, can you talk about, for people who may not be interested in traditional reporting or don't think that they are journalism, don't think that their skill is useful in journalism. When you started staffing up ICIJ, what kind of people were you looking for? And what are the range of skills that strong newsrooms are looking for now?
Yeah, look, I think I based a lot of my experience on being an executive at a newspaper when I realized, and also my own experience as a reporter. I have never met a reporter who has got everything. Like you might have a track star who can do everything, or a football player who can do everything. But in journalism, what I found is that some of us are really good at researching. Some of us are really good at writing. Some of us are really good at data. Some of us are just very clever at doing other things like speaking. And so if you can put all that together, you've got a much better, like by working together. Now, again, I learned that from being a terrible writer, but teaming up with somebody who was a great writer. So all of my early investigations were with this other reporter who was able to go away for the weekend, come back with perfectly finished copy. It didn't do me any good in the long run because I never learned how to write because of that, you know. But you know what I mean. What I learned was that if you know, so when I started ICIJ with the 3 people, when we started getting a bit of money in, I went and hired a tech team. So we basically, right now we have about 40 people working for us, and 10 of them are tech people. And we have 3 specialists who protect our technology, and 7 people who are working on new forms of how to do things better, like using AI and other things. And so, and I've got a lot of editing, because what I've also found is a lot of reporters like me can't write. And so, and we're also working with reporters who are in different languages, and so their language skills aren't the same as what we need. So we have got a lot of really editors who write and rewrite all the time. And then I've got actually very few reporters. There's only, gosh, I don't remember how many we have. We've got fewer than 8 reporters. Yeah. But again, our model relies on finding the story and then getting the work from the other outlets. So when we're doing these big projects, ICIJ will do fully formed global stories, while the British reporters will focus on what they think is important in their country, but we get the benefit of their research, because the rules of ICIJ are that if you see something, you have to say it, and then you have to put context around it. And then when the reporters are talking in that online newsroom, they're talking to each other about what they're seeing, and then what happens in the end is that if, like, say, a good example in Panama Papers, someone spotted a very famous sports star who was putting his image rights into offshore companies and avoiding taxes in the country that he was in. And eventually, you know, the reporter put that up and said, I've just spotted, you know, I can't remember who it was, a soccer star. And then everyone else went, oh, I wonder if any of my soccer stars are in there. And then suddenly, before you knew it, we had a whole thread going on about this. And we had some of the biggest sports stars in the world that were in the documents that we hadn't even noticed. I remember we even found Lionel Messi.
Maybe that's because you were calling it soccer and it's called football
of course. Well, we typed in tennis, football, again, all the search terms you use, you know. But we ended up with, I mean, a lot of, I think even 2 weeks ago, I think one of the international managers, they're still paying taxes, they're still being prosecuted because of our work from 9 years ago. Wow. And we had like Lionel Messi, who was the most famous soccer player in the world, and now we've cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know, because he was doing the same thing.
Great. Well, I think we have time for one more question. No, I'm being told no.
Okay.
Okay, no, really no? Okay, really no. Thank you so much. This has been really enlightening. And would you mind giving us, where can we go as academics and others to find your library?
Well, I should also mention that we are a nonprofit. We rely entirely on donations to keep this work going. But you can find us on, I think it's www.icij.org, which is our website.
Great.
And, and thank you so much for listening.
Please join me in giving Gerard Ryle a warm round of applause. Thank you so much.